Welcome everyone to the 2021 COPE seminar. I'm Daniel Culp, Chair of COPE and Senior Director of Editorial Development for the Journals of the American Chemical Society. It is my pleasure to open the seminar and introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Deborah Poff. This week will be 9 fascinating sessions on a broad spectrum of topics of current interest, including data, AI, paper mills, and DEI. I expect quite a bit of robust discussion on each topic, and I'm very much looking forward to the week ahead. We recently closed our call for volunteers to join Council. At this time, I would like to announce the 6 newest members. Itamar Ashkenazi from the Israel Institute of Technology, my apologies. Patrick Franzen from SPIE. Jason Hu from the Taylor and Francis Group, Anubhav Pradham from India, Jennifer Wright from Cambridge University Press, and Jiayi Zhu from China. Congratulations and welcome to Council. And congratulations to our 2 returning members of Council, Tim Deviney from the Leeds University Business School and Laura Wilson from Emerald Publishing. In 2021, we are introducing a number of new resources, which includes guidelines on editorial participation and editing of peer reviews, a flowchart on handling of post-publication critiques. A special thank you to Wiley for collaborating with COPE on this, and discussion documents on AI and decision-making and diversity and inclusion in scholarly publishing. The latter is due out later or in the upcoming month. We also recently released a repeat of COPE's 2018 survey on diversity and peer review to see how the environment may have changed over the past 3 years. Please take a few moments to complete the survey. We hope to present results in the next forum scheduled in a few weeks. COPE has been very busy. We will soon open COPE membership for universities and research institutions, which will broaden our commitment to facilitate discussions across all stakeholders to preserve and maintain the integrity of the published literature. You should soon see an updated version of the principles of transparency and best practices in scholarly publishing. In collaboration with the OAJ, OASPA, and WAMI, this document lays out the basic principles which inform our evaluation of new members. We will also be rolling out new resources, providing guidance on the handling of paper mills and supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, which will include guidance on name changes and historically offensive content. So thank you very much. And now with further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Deborah Poff, the past chair of COPE. Deborah Poff is a retired professor of philosophy and senior academic administrator. She holds a PhD in philosophy of science. Over the course of her career, she has been an active researcher, teacher, editor, and she has held a number of administrative positions, including president and vice chancellor at various Canadian universities. Deborah is the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Academic Ethics, which she has edited for over 20 years, and is currently the editor of the Journal of Scholarly Publishing, published by University of Toronto Press. Her research and publication interests include applied ethics, including business and professional ethics, research ethics, publication ethics, leadership ethics, and feminist studies. She has been recognized many times for her activities in scholarship, and in 2016, Deborah was awarded the Order of Canada. Deborah has served 9 years on COPE Council and the Board of Trustees, including in the role of chair. She is a recognized leader in the field of publication ethics. And so now I turn over the virtual podium to my COPE colleague and mentor, Deborah Poff.
Thanks very much, Dan. If I could have the first slide of my presentation, please. Okay, this slide, I put a lot more information than I'm actually going to speak to. The only point I want to make on this first slide is when we look at bringing together universities and the researchers who do create the knowledge in universities to journal editors and publishers, I think the best way for us to collaborate and to meet mutual interests is to focus on our shared principles and our shared interests. In the late 70s, early 80s, Harvard University came out with a number of books and documents on getting past any adversarial negotiations and looking to interest-based bargaining or interest-based resolution of conflict, where you actually try to focus on your shared values. And our shared values are pretty clear in editing and publishing and universities and university faculty. And that's the creation of new knowledge, the creation of knowledge with integrity, the dissemination of knowledge with integrity. And I think as long as we strategically focus on that, as we try to negotiate with different players and different stakeholders in the research and publication field, we're much more apt to get some joint and collaborative solutions to problems. Next slide, please. So in the next little while, I'm going to try to accomplish the following. Provide an environmental scan on the current state of Western universities globally. And I think people will find it a bit negative, but there's overwhelming research evidence to support that we're not in the greatest shape with respect to universities. I'm focusing on liberal democracies and democratic nation states because they've been the leader in pushing a lot of the things that impacts not only the universities in those countries, but also in other countries. And this includes things like the pressure to rank high in international rankings. And it's had, I think, a deleterious effect on many, many universities. Addressing the changing pressures on scholarly productivity that can impact the frequency of scholarly misconduct by faculty. Identify the changing attitudes of faculty to peer review, copyright, open access, and productivity, and identify responses of universities to faculty misconduct and propose strategies for collaboration between universities and editors / publishers with respect to the investigation of allegations of misconduct. Next slide, please. So there was a heyday in the modern university that followed World War II, where many, many democratic nation states built, not only expanded existing universities, but built many new universities, believing that we were in a halcyon day of looking to universities as agents to foster modernity, science and technology, economic and social mobility, and progressive political and economic futures. All of this began to change and unravel in the 1970s forward. It's usually attributed to the ideology of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And it's also aligned with the international movement of globalization and neoliberalism that we currently live through. Next slide, please. Current factors impacting universities. With globalization and neoliberalism, the attitudes of governments towards universities has shifted significantly. University education, which post-World War II was perceived as for the common good and for the good of citizenship generally, became perceived primarily as a private benefit to the individual rather than a public benefit to the state. As a private benefit, students were expected to assume more of the costs of an education. This was followed by a reduction in the financial support for universities in terms of their base operating funds. And there was a concomitant rise in university tuition and fees, which were passed along to students. The new political realities encourage entrepreneurial and private industrial partnerships with universities and looking to applied research and new technology as the emphasis in all strategic plans. There was an emphasis in thinking of universities primarily as existing for the future education of new citizens and the creation of new knowledge, to characterizing universities as corporate entities. Sorry, I've got people, I've got a hard time seeing the entire screen, so I'm going to have to read it from my notes. Characterizing corporate entities existing within a highly competitive national and international environment, vying to attract consumers. And this is where we first start getting students called consumers and clients, that is, consumers as the market for students, as well as competing for prestigious grants and funds for researchers. This propensity was strengthened through the development of comparative key indicators of performance and the emergence of national and international rankings of excellence. When I was, for a number of years, I edited a ranking journal called the Journal of Business Ethics. And as soon as the Journal of Business Ethics was ranked by the Financial Times as one of the key places to publish for the best business schools in the world, universities started paying professors bonuses to publish in the journal, which of course had nothing to do with the impact of the quality of the journal, but it certainly had a significant impact on the workload. More recently, in the Trump era and in the right-wing movements of a number of countries, there's been a growth of populism and nationalism. And what it's really, there's a number of books out, very good books out, about it. There's a corollary erosion of respect for education and higher education and respect for specific expertise that's happened in a number of countries. As well, there's a rise in the stature of disciplines that attract external research funds and private sector partnerships, and a consequent diminishing of funds available in the disciplines of arts, humanities, and social science. There is a recognized failure of universities to achieve many of the goals of social and economic mobility for students from lower and middle class income backgrounds, and the increasing level of debt load among poor students, higher levels of attrition prior to graduation compared to upper middle class students and upper middle class students, and a wage gap between graduates from higher socioeconomic backgrounds compared to students from lower or middle class backgrounds. And what we assumed post World War II was that with increased education, you'd actually have economic and social mobility so that people could change classes. That's actually a minority of people who have actually done that. And most likely that the status that people enter university with is the status that they will have all their life, which has been a bit depressing for those of us who were committed to that vision of progressive social mobility. The response to budgetary constraints has resulted in a growing number of part-time, underpaid, and limited term faculty employees for universities, with both diminished status and economic differentiation from tenure track and tenured university faculty. There's a fragmentation and a division within universities concerning the nature of knowledge. And part of this, we all know as the diversity and inclusivity and equity movement that we were all responding to in universities as well as in publishing, where we question, where there's a question of the legitimacy of all forms of knowledge and allegations that some forms of practice in the university are dominant and hegemonic and aren't particularly scientific and create a number of value disparities. For whatever it's worth, whether you believe that or not, it's certainly a reality and in the lived experience of people working in universities. And there's a growing division and distrust between university administrators and university faculty. And this is one as part of my lived experience. I've been both a faculty member and a senior university administrator. And there's a fair bit of anger and hostility and divisiveness between faculty and university administrators these days. So these values have also had an impact on other countries. So I said that I was looking at Western democratic nation states and the universities in those countries. but it's largely impacted many, many other countries. If you look at India, and India through their UGC has largely embraced international rankings. They've raised the standards of performance for graduating PhDs and for initial tenure track appointments, particularly in terms of publication, but also in terms of grant. Where people were expected to be when they graduated for a PhD, the thresholds changed to something more like where they're expected to be for their first appointment in a university. And of course, China has significantly increased STM funding for research. It's committed to international rankings, and it's increased competition among universities and faculties. So what has this done to young scholars and new faculty appointments? Well, where there's fewer permanent full-time, sorry, you're hearing my cat in the background. I can't do anything about that except shut the door, which I've done. Fewer permanent full-time position means more competition, more part-time teaching, less time for research. Grants are dependent on publication records, so there's more pressure to publish. This has resulted in changing values among the faculty. There is less commitment to service. I've been surprised over the last number of years to have people saying to me they don't want to do free peer reviews for journals. And they describe them as free labor, free peer reviews. In my generation, where we actually got to be tenured and be promoted to full professor, this was just part of the service that you knew was part of your commitment to as a professional. There's anger about traditional copyright transfer. Again, career patterns have changed for many who previously saw it was a quid pro quo. I didn't mind signing over my copyright because I was being published in journals that people would read my scholarly research, and this would lead to promotions, and promotions lead to status, and they lead to raises in income. But there's now a generation of people who don't see this pattern. And so there's all sorts of anger and frustration about the peer review system, particularly with respect to commercial publishers. There's a frustration of about the lack of compensation for publications. People say, why am I doing this? I don't get paid for it. And there's a push to support open access journals. So in the culture of haves and have-nots among faculty, there's competitive edge matters, and therefore publication matters. International rankings equate to more universities focused on rewards for publication and grant success. People used to be able to have successful careers where their emphasis was on teaching and they had to do research, but maybe the research was a little lighter. That's shifted significantly. With increased publication, you can look for people who do both really well. There's an increased temptation, I would suggest, consequently, to take the easier path to publication through FF&P, through data manipulation, image manipulation, through text recycling, through redundant publication, through submissions to predatory publishers, and to attending predatory conferences. Just the context has changed significantly, and people's identification with their profession has changed. And with that, I think there's more temptation to take an easier path. For universities, what's changed? Well, more people are paying attention. Reputational risk has risen. When misconduct becomes public, donors notice, journalists notice, the government notices, the funders notice, the bloggers notice. As well, universities operate under labor law and frequently with negotiated and ratified terms of employment. Such laws and practices generally entrench principles of natural justice, confidentiality, representation by unions or by associations, etc. So what's changed for journals and publishers? Well, the same thing. Reputational risk has also increased. As with universities, more people are paying attention, including journalists, blogs, funders of research. When you have misconduct appear in a journal publication or a series of these, which has happened to a number of people, a number of very public scandals of people who publish for years and then been found to have doctored their findings or created their findings. The reputation of journals and publishers depends on the integrity of the published scholarly record. Failures to limit or address allegations of misconduct in the published research can be harshly critiqued. Okay, so that was all background. Where do we go from here? And you know, for the years that I've been on COPE, I've heard editors and publishers, and I've been one of those editors, frustrated by contacting a university and saying, we think you need to do an investigation here. It looks like there's we have some serious concerns and allegations of misconduct, and then you never hear from the university again. More recently, I've heard the same complaints from universities who say they contact editors or publishers and say they want an article retracted, and the editor drags their feet or doesn't do anything. And so we have these different cultures. We have a lack sometimes of understanding for each other's realities. So I've given you a sort of a lens of what's going on in universities. There's less money, there's more competition. 80% of university budgets are faculty salaries. Faculty believe that administrators take up most of the salary, but it's actually the majority of people are your teachers. And so what do you do to save money? Well, you cut tenure track positions and you hire part-time people who are disenfranchised, angry, and unsatisfied with their role. So where do we go from here? Well, from 2012 to fairly recently, a number of people from COPE have been involved in a project they call CLUE, which involved a number of meetings, including 2 sets of meetings at the World Congress for Research Integrity in different years. Involved multi-stakeholder consultations among researchers, editors, publishers, and universities to try to come up with best practices to facilitate correcting the scholarly record. And I give you the citation for that. The final paper was just published this April in 2021. And many of the recommendations are very helpful. They're a useful starting point. They talk about a necessary collaborative dialogue that COPE is pursuing, and one of the main motivations for COPE, implementing a new category of membership called university membership that Dan spoke about at the beginning. Okay, and this is from that article. They include established policy and procedures for university investigations and clarity of sharing key determinations of facts related to the results of those investigations with the editors. Identifiable offices responsible for investigations. Editors frequently say they are mystified when they go into the matrix of offices in universities trying to figure out where's the appropriate place to talk to someone about an allegation of misconduct. And responsibility for all research undertaken at university. For journals, the article identifies criteria for how, what, why information and evidence is passed by editors to universities. And for funders, it recommends set policy for retention of research data in terms of duration requirements and to ensure relations and obligations identified for institutions with respect to funded research. And there's many more useful recommendations in this article, and it should prove a valuable guide for collaborative solutions and decision-making for all stakeholders in the future. So these are my last considerations. And I think in many ways, I've changed my mind about some of these things. And number one is one of the places I've changed my mind. As an editor, I have frequently made the statement that COPE frequently makes, that our commitment, publishers and editors' commitment, is only to the scholarly record. We're not interested in misconduct, we're not interested in blame, and we're not interested in investigating, and it's inappropriate for us to investigate the behavior because we're not the employer of the faculty member. And I've recently come to think that's not helpful as a description, but it's not even descriptively correct. Of course, we all care about the different, we don't just say whether it's an error of an honest mistake or whether it's misconduct, it's all the same to us. We only care about the scholarly record. We actually care a lot about research integrity. We actually care a lot. It's a joint value that we care about methodological rigor, that we care about commitment to integrity, ethics, and values in the creation of knowledge that we then disseminate as editors and publishers. So I kind of think we should think a little more about our language around how we describe this when we say our job is just to make sure the scholarly record is correct. Secondly, universities' relations to funders and concerns of erosion of autonomy in governance must be respected. Countries differ in their relationship between the government funder and the university. And I know in the United States, because I've heard it from the people who work in the funding agencies who do the investigations, they would rather that the publisher or the editor go straight to the funder and tell them what they allege or what they think might be going on, because they don't want the researcher to have a heads up to be able to cover their tracks if they've done misconduct. I think in my country, we think more of the university as being the gatekeeper and having a responsibility, a legal responsibility, as well as an ethical responsibility to hold all those grants. Although a principal investigator has the grant to do research, the universities actually hold the grants. And violations in their process and respecting their autonomy may be ill-advised and hard to deal with if you're a university that worries about the integrity of all of your research grants and protecting the governance structure of allowing your faculty to continue to do their research, even when there's a suspicion about one particular research project or one particular individual. So I think we have to be a little cautious about how we actually deal with funders as editors and publishers. And going directly to the funder may cause a lot of discomfort on the part of the university. And lastly, the fact that many violations of research integrity result in investigations of a research product are far more complex and embedded in issues that are extensive than has been always understood with respect to a particular article. It's, in the clue document, it says that, labor law may need to be changed because universities operate under particular labor laws. But I actually think it's far more complex than the labor law. It's that I very rarely, and I've had to deal with a lot of misconduct in my career, I very rarely found someone cleanly and neatly manipulating data without any other implications or behavior in their career generally. And the complexity of this means that it will be sometimes extremely difficult for universities to share all of the information that's relevant to a particular case of misconduct. And I'll give you one example, and I could give you many. I've worked at 5 universities, so it really is anonymized and shouldn't be able to be tracked. And I can think of a woman who had very few publications. She was in her final year. She had to go up for tenure. She wasn't successful at grants. She wasn't successful at publications. She misappropriated her grad students' research, submitted it to a journalist, was accepted and published without any credit for the student or any even informing the student she was doing this. And of course, that's bad behavior, and she didn't get tenure and her employment was terminated. But what was going on in her life was far more complex. She had married a man who was extremely productive and who made it very clear that he would divorce her and leave her if she didn't get tenure. So I give that as an example because there's a lot of things that I'm never going to tell, as an administrator, I'm never going to tell people personal contentious issues and complex issues and embedded issues in people's lives that precipitate wrongdoing. I've had 3 cases in my career of theft, misappropriation of funds. In 2 cases, they were research grants. In 1 case, it was the base operating fund of the university. They stole from the university or from the grant, and then they committed fraud, faking invoices and trying to cover up their track record. 1 was trivial and easily handled. 2 were very serious, and both ended up in the termination of the person's employment, which also meant the termination probably of their career. If this happens to a senior tenured faculty member, the chances are they're not going to get another, you're closing their career. In both cases of serious cases, our legal advisors said there's no point in pursuing criminality here. It would look petty. It would harm the public relations of the university because it would get out, and it would do no more justice than just terminating their career. So in both these cases, the employment was terminated. The file was closed with what you call tombstone references. So if they had a prospect of another job and they called the university would only say they were employed here from 2010 to 2019 period, and would give no reference. And that's sufficiently devastating that I think they were right. The criminal pursuit of these people would have been wrong, but nobody's going to tell you these things. And I've dealt with addiction problems, which are considered a disability and have to be accommodated. You can't fire people, you have to help them. I've dealt with suicide, divorce, cancer, terminal cancer. And a lot of times when people are involved in bad behavior, they're involved in really messy behavior. And so I don't think any change in labor law is going to help this. But as long as we work together to try to come to common understanding of what is a problem we can solve, I think that the problem is not intractable. So that's my little trip through universities, the new faculty, and the problem of scholarly misconduct. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Just a reminder to all the attendees, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box, and then I will relay them to Deborah. So we have a couple questions already, Deborah. One of them sort of relates back to some of your background material. The point about the reduction in respect for academic or professional experts in the current political era. What role does COPE have potentially in defending the expertise and evidence?
Yeah, I think that COPE has a big role to play, and it could be a collaborative role with universities. Universities are dealing with this problem of scholarship and expertise and experience in higher education being dismissed in this populist time and this nationalistic time. And I think the informed dialogue about the importance of confirming real knowledge, progressive knowledge, knowledge that's factually helps us to understand scientific problems, that helps us understand human problems, that helps us understand empirical evidence about human psychology and human sociology, that we can be a player in a dialogue about the importance of true knowledge, true expertise, the dissemination of that knowledge through scholarly publications.
Thank you, Deborah. There's another question. The attendee agrees that research integrity, conduct, behavior, and values are all essential in how we think about publication ethics in the scholarly record. How should COPE guidance evolve in order to really embed this point? To what extent can a voluntary organization like COPE, or even editors and publishers, truly hold individual researchers to account?
Yeah, it's a matter of the values of the organization. I think we all have fallen prey to the line that we are the disseminators of the product, and whether it's an honest mistake or whether it's a misconduct, all our issue and our focus is on correcting the scholarly record. I think COPE as an organization knows that research integrity and scholarly integrity in publications are on a continuum. It's and that continuum impacts universities in the dissemination of knowledge to students as well. We didn't used to teach ethics to students. We now, in many disciplines, think research ethics and business ethics and moral thinking are fundamental for an educated person who will make decisions all of their life that have a meaningful impact on human behavior and human life and the quality of human life. And I think for COPE, as an organization that represents the values of scholarly inquiry through the publication of research, we can play quite a public role. And in our relationship with universities, as university membership moves forward, we can support universities in coming up with a clear joint message about the importance of integrity and methodological rigor, but also moral integrity in the pursuit of knowledge.
Very good. Thank you, Deborah. So we have another question from Kate Redmond. She's saying that in her experience as an editor, that there's an increasing difficulty in obtaining good reviewers. How do you think the incentivization of reviewers, be it financial or something like Publons, through recognition, alters the integrity of peer review?
Yeah, my own personal view is recognition is more important than financial compensation. I've been in discussions where people have disagreed with that. But it seems to me that the amount of, I don't review book manuscripts, and I've reviewed many over the years of monograph proposals and book manuscripts for $300 worth of free books, which is generally the kind of compensation you get, or $200 worth of free books, which generally is one book these days. But I do think that a lot of faculty are struggling with the changing dynamics in the workplace, the lack of security, the additional stressors, the additional sense of competition, and to recognize their expertise, that they are serious scholars and recognized reviewers. Any way that you can recognize the value of their contribution, I think is more important than financial compensation.
Actually, while we're waiting for additional Q&As from the audience, I have a question for you. Toward the end of your talk, you talked about the relationship a bit between universities and journals, or at least their responsibilities. We understand that universities have clear contractual relationship with the researchers that become authors, and journals have maybe more of an implicit contract with those same researchers. But what is the real basis of the relationship between the universities and journals? What should be their expectations? How do they cooperate or work together, in this space?
Yeah. Originally, I thought I had a chunk on this talk, but it was just getting too long, on the original university presses, because universities recognized very early, and universities like Cambridge University Press, Oxford University, recognized that the relationship between the creation of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge was an immediate, important, they took ownership of it. And then for various reasons, frequently now financial, they have, for many universities, have gotten out of the university publishing business. And it's led, I think, to a false dichotomy, a belief that there's a difference between our responsibility in ensuring that people have the facilities and resources to create knowledge, and then your job in the dissemination of research. Because if you don't have the dissemination of research, you don't have the research, you don't have the record, you don't have anything for people to study and read and learn and continue in the inquiry in whatever particular area of research it is. And I think that's led to an artificial barriers where universities don't seem to understand that how much they need journals, publishers, book publishers for the humanists and to a certain extent the social scientists, journal publishers for everybody, and that it's without those mechanisms for dissemination, the knowledge goes nowhere, except to the extent that people can actually create opportunities for students to learn, which is important. But aside from that, the larger project of the creation of new knowledge is lost. And so it's a critically important relationship. And we have to have a mutual understanding, which often doesn't happen anymore. I mean, it just doesn't. Universities just think about their own domain, journals think about their own domain, and that doesn't work very well. That's just not functional.
Thank you. We have a few more questions in the Q&A box. As a country's culture on publication ethics matures, how would you advise that we deal with the semblance of marginal, unethical conduct in regard to authorship, validity of data, or other aspects of scholarly activities that we consider not to be completely ethical?
Well, unfortunately, I think there's two ways. As an educator, I think education is critically important. And I think we've learned that, and it's why in research methods courses, and for most professions, there's ethics courses now. For most people studying, even at the undergraduate level, but definitely at the graduate level, there's an emphasis on the importance of research integrity. But the other side of it is unfortunately the ugly side, which is the disciplinary aspects. And I think that universities have to recognize, they are the employers. They have to recognize that certain behaviors are not acceptable. They're just not acceptable. Some of them can be disciplined. Some of them can be considered to be stupidity or ignorance or newness of your experience or whatever, but they have to be challenged very seriously. And any kind of repetition of that behavior has to be dealt with, unfortunately, punitively.
So another question in the box sort of changes direction a little. This person notes that there's a global trend, and this includes in China, to emphasize less on impact factor and bringing other metrics up for clarity. What's your input on that? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it really varies by discipline. Being a philosopher, very, very few philosophy articles are ever cited. I mean, it just is the case that impact factors, if you looked at impact factors as the most important criterion to evaluate the performance and the productivity of a scholar in my field, they would fail miserably. It really is dependent on discipline. If you look at the timeline, at one point I did some research on the timeline by discipline for citation. And in the sciences, it's fairly quick. And technological fields, it's fairly quick. In the humanities, it can be much slower. You can find yourself being cited after a decade in the humanities. So I think there has to be an appreciation of the disciplinary variability in terms of the importance of this as an evaluative tool.
Thank you. I was also thinking, as you know, you were noting that sort of research is being politicized in some areas, especially like in the US, that's becoming a major issue. Do you feel that there may be an impact on journals in the future if this politicization of research becomes more pronounced globally?
Yeah. I think that it's a complex area because there's legitimacy, there's areas of legitimacy and there's areas that aren't valid. And I say that having done research in feminist scholarship and having edited a journal in feminist scholarship for a while. There's definitely bias in some areas in peer review, and there's definitely bias in the marginalization of some kinds of knowledge. And I think most of us recognize that, which is why publishers have been working so hard to get standards and educational processes on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. There's also some politically loaded research that isn't very good research. And it's really, I think, critically important that we come up with standards so that we can fairly evaluate what's good in, say, feminist studies and what's not so good. And there has to be the ability to say, no, it's not that we're biased. It's not that we're politically discriminatory against this discipline. It's just that this is an inferior piece of research and should be rejected. And that's a really challenging and dicey area. And again, having been a senior administrator in universities that had a number of departments that were very politicized departments, and seeing people often unable to get along in those departments, which is tragic. As long as you're fighting with each other, I don't think the real predators of discrimination have to worry. They can go grandly on their way. And we just have to get to a place where we can appropriately and with expertise evaluate politically loaded identity politic kind of research and do it fairly.
Thank you. So talking about standards, there's another question in the Q&A revolving around preprints, right? There's a growing popularity of preprints, but there's also been a large number of retractions from work coming from preprints. Do you think the ethics can keep up with this as it evolves?
My own feelings about this is there's disciplines in which this makes sense. I really can't understand why you'd need a preprint in philosophy. It's a discipline. Now, there are areas in philosophy that are in artificial intelligence and physics, and that there may be some legitimacy to an argument that you're doing something so innovative, you want it to hit the market in a very timely way. But I would think for the majority of humanists, I really don't see the value in non-refereed research in the humanities. People can disagree with that, but I do think that there's a sacrifice and a potential danger of not vetting things properly on the grounds that you have to be so competitive, you have to publish before you go through a review process.
Following up on that, there's a question here that says, this applies to preprints from grant-funded research. So any suggestions there?
Well, grants-funded research, you get grants-funded, it still has the disciplinary mix. I mean, you get grants in all disciplines. I think most funders want you to ultimately have refereed publications for your research. They're accountable. Particularly if this is federally government-funded research in whatever country, you're basically using taxpayers' dollars to fund intellectual work. So I would think that most funders would ultimately want research that has been funded to go through a vetting process of peer review by experts in the field.
And I see that there's, again, another follow-up sort of on the preprint topic. And this involves the question of, do preprints prioritize the need of the individual? So giving, right, so the individual getting it out quickly, getting, I guess, credit for it, versus the collective, sort of the civil society. Do you have any thoughts about sort of that balance between, I guess, the need for the gold star of publications versus getting information out into the society quickly?
That's a very complex question. That's a hard question. I think the best, a lot of people who do preprints also go on to publish their research ultimately in peer-reviewed venues, and I think that's desirable. The more accountability structures we can put in place for universities, I think the more to get back to the loss of credibility, the loss of prestige of educated people, and the creation of knowledge, the more we can put accountabilities in place, the more we can justify the expenditure of public dollars for the common good, which I think education should be. It shouldn't just be up for the individual. It should be for the common good.
Yeah, and then of course the follow-up from this attendee is just that preprints in the medical sciences, over the last 18 months during the pandemic, have led to medical advances happening early in save lives. Though to add on to it, of course, there's been a lot of concerns about the unvetted part of the.
That's right. That's right.
So again,
you've had positive results during COVID, and you've had negative impact of articles that were ultimately deemed to be unscientific or problematic.
Okay.
It's a funny thing. I'm making a last comment. If you look at the history of peer review, which I think probably a lot of people who've been listening to this are, it's only very recently in history that we've had rigorous peer review. I mean, when journals started, when peer review started, there was a heck of a lot of, you're my friend and I'm mentoring you and I'll get you in a journal, and or people coming to listen to a talk and saying, that's great, I'll publish it, and going through no peer review system. And editors, I think there's this sometimes misguided sense that we're still like that. So you get young scholars saying, oh, you're all corrupt gatekeepers and you only do what you want to do. And but it's a pretty funny history. Peer review has a pretty unbalanced, privileged history. And it's only been fairly recently that we have rigorously tried to eliminate bias, prejudice, favoritism, mentorship, wink, wink, nod, nod, old boys network, old girls network, whatever. We can't take it be too hard on ourselves, because I think we've significantly improved the process methodologically and ethically.
Okay, well, thank you, Deborah. I think we'll end on that point. We're 5 minutes to the hour, and following proper Zoom etiquette, I think it's a good opportunity to release the attendees for potentially future meetings coming up at the hour. So I want to thank you, Deborah, for your keynote and for answering the questions so thoughtfully. I also want to give all my thanks to the COPE staff for managing and running the seminar and keeping things moving smoothly. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending. I hope you enjoy the other sessions throughout the week. Look forward to seeing you there virtually and hearing more from you. So again, thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.